We had been advancing along the creek's bank, carefully examining the ground for any traces or items that could shed light on Ethan's disappearance. For a whole week now, we had been searching for my friend and colleague, a national park ranger who vanished during his daily patrol and failed to make contact. As we initiated the search operation, we soon realized the vastness of our park and the daunting task of thoroughly searching it. Other rescue services, as well as friends, relatives, and volunteers, joined us, but so far, it hadn't yielded any results. A sudden rustle in the trees made me instantly raise my head. I recognized it as an eagle struggling to ascend into the air, its wings beating powerfully and causing the branches to sway under its weight. Continuing on, I kept my gaze fixed on the sky until I stumbled, barely maintaining my balance from an imminent fall. Regaining my footing, my eyes suddenly caught something glimmering in the water under the sunlight. Crouching by the bank and rolling up my sleeve, I retrieved a metal badge from the cool stream. With anticipation gripping my heart, I examined it. It was Ethan's badge. This find became a long-awaited breakthrough in our search. Excitedly, I called out to Sarah, who was nearby, and showed her my discovery. Her face lit up with excitement. Finally, after 2 weeks of relentless searching, we found a lead. Immediately contacting our colleagues, I informed them of our location and discovery. Then, together with Sarah, we continued to follow along the creek, winding up the slope. Reasoning that the current might have carried the badge from higher points, we carefully scanned every nook along its banks, hoping to uncover more. Our path soon led us to dense undergrowth, and entering it, we continued along the rushing water. The tree canopies intertwined tightly above us, casting a dim light in which cool silence prevailed, occasionally interrupted by the rustle of leaves. Venturing deeper into the forest, we unexpectedly stumbled upon an ancient Native American burial ground, hidden from the world by dense vegetation. The place seemed frozen in time, with graves engulfed by earth and tree roots. We cautiously made our way among the stone mounds, treading carefully on forgotten paths, when suddenly an astonishing sight greeted our eyes. In the center of the burial ground, in a small clearing, stood an ancient altar. Carved from stone, it was covered in moss and lichen, bearing witness to its unimaginable age. Inscribed symbols and pictograms adorned the altar, their meanings lost to time, but undoubtedly indicating its sacred purpose. Approaching closer, we felt a strange, almost electric tension in the air, as if the place still teemed with ancient energy. I glanced around for clues and noticed something protruding from under the grass. Drawing closer, I realized it was a torn piece of a shirt, identical in color to mine. This discovery alarmed me. I beckoned Sarah, and we decided to continue our search in that direction. As we walked along the trail, we carefully examined every bush, and soon we found a strange track. It resembled a wolf track in some ways, but was sized more like a bear's, although the paw shape was entirely different. What could it be? This find put us on edge, and we began to thoroughly search the surroundings. Here, we found items that apparently belonged to Ethan. However, they were torn to shreds, with traces of blood nearby. We continued our search in hopes of finding at least a body, but found nothing. It was strange. It seemed Ethan was attacked by some animal, but whether he escaped was unclear. We contacted the base and called in specialists. While we awaited their arrival, fog enveloped the area. It was highly unexpected, as specific conditions such as low temperature and evaporation are required for fog formation. It seemed as if someone had activated a smoke machine, and the fog began spreading through the forest. I looked at Sarah. Alarm was evident in her eyes, and I felt out of place myself. Suddenly, we heard some noise among the trees. Due to the fog, visibility was poor, but I distinctly noticed some creature darting past us. I drew my pistol, and Sarah did the same. We stood back to back, trying to understand what surrounded us. Then came clicking sounds as if a skeleton was clacking its jaws. After that, red lights appeared around us, emerging in pairs. I realized they were glowing eyes. Damn, what's happening? I thought. In all my ranger career, I had never encountered anything like this. The sounds and glowing eyes drew closer, the circle tightening, but suddenly we heard voices to our left. It was the backup we had called for. The lights abruptly dimmed, and the fog began to dissipate. We understood that our colleagues had thwarted the attack. Soon, a man in police uniform approached us, whom I recognized immediately. It was Detective Harris, who worked in our small town. Overall, he was good at his job. Seeing our alarmed faces, he immediately asked, "Hey guys, what's going on? What scared you like this?" We shared the story with him, and he listened attentively, though he couldn't hide his skepticism, noting how hard it was to believe. We didn't try to convince him. The forensic experts began examining the crime scene, cordoning it off with yellow tape. After a couple of hours, they reached a preliminary conclusion. There had been an attack by an unknown animal, but it remained unclear whether the person had survived. We surveyed the area, but no further traces were found. With time still left until evening, we expanded the search radius, but unfortunately, it was fruitless. In the evening, we returned to base, after which I got into my pickup and headed into town. In my pocket lay Ethan's badge. The journey took about half an hour. Exiting the highway, I turned onto a small street lined with neat houses. Pulling up opposite one of them, I got out of the car and climbed the porch. Knocking, I waited. Soon, a young woman emerged with a child in her arms. Her face bore the signs of difficult times. Dark circles under her eyes and a tear-stained face. She was Ethan's wife. When she saw me, hope flickered in her eyes, but upon seeing my somber expression, she bit her lip with pain. "Hey, Jess, how are you? Did you find anything?" She interrupted me without answering. I nodded, pulling the badge from my pocket, and recounted what we had discovered today, expressing the possibility that Ethan might be dead. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wiped them away with her hand and said, "I don't believe he's dead. I feel he's alive. So don't tell me that again." I apologized to her and said that we would continue the search. After that, I bid her farewell. It was already dark when I decided I needed to clear my head. I headed to the local bar, parked my pickup, and looked around. People were casually discussing their everyday problems. At that moment, I found it hard to relate to them. In the bar, I ordered myself a couple of beers and sat contemplating the day's events. Suddenly, someone sat down next to me. Turning around, I recognized David Harris, the detective I had met earlier. He also ordered a beer. We sat in silence for a couple of minutes, after which David asked, "Listen, about the stuff you told today. Did it really happen, or could it have been a hallucination?" I nodded. "Yeah, it was real unexplainable madness. For the first time in my life, I encountered something like that. Plus, Ethan's mysterious disappearance and the remnants of his clothes. You know, I never really believed in the supernatural, but this time, I even felt like going to church and praying. Understand? When faced with something inexplicable, you start looking for some grain of rationality, but," David continued, "I believe there's an explanation for everything. You just have to search. I'm sorry about your friend, but someday we'll unravel this mystery." We continued drinking until late at night, immersed in thoughts and discussions about a world that turned out to be much more mysterious and ambiguous than we could have imagined. A phone call woke me up early in the morning. Answering the phone, I heard David's familiar voice. "Good morning, Mike. We've got trouble. Could you come and help?" he asked. I agreed, quickly got dressed, washed up, and without wasting time on breakfast, called a taxi. 20 minutes later, I arrived at the specified address. It was a farm with several police cars already parked outside. Entering, I noticed David and his colleagues talking to, presumably, the farm owner. Spotting me, David motioned for me to join him. "Something similar to yesterday's happened here. I'd like you to assess the tracks and listen to the witness, comparing it to what happened yesterday," he said. I nodded in agreement, and we approached the farmer. He was a man in his 40s with a thick beard, dressed in coveralls. Genuine fear was evident in his eyes. That alone made me worry. The man named Bill began to recount. I woke up to the sound of the dogs barking. Usually they don't just bark for no reason, and when they encounter something unfamiliar, the barking becomes more intense. This time it seemed like they were in a fight. I felt fear, thinking that some animal or stranger might have gotten onto the property. Grabbing my gun, I headed to the yard, which was shrouded in fog. With a flashlight in hand, I tried to light the way, but could see only a few feet ahead. Instinctively, I headed towards the barn, where the dog barking was coming from. As I approached, I heard a plaintive whimper, and then everything went silent. Continuing forward, I looked around for danger when suddenly a pair of eyes lit up to my left, and then another to my right. One by one, multiple glowing eyes appeared around me. After that, I heard clicking sounds. It really scared me. I started backing away, but the circle was closing in. You understand, I was terrified. I fired my gun in all directions, but the eyes started disappearing one by one. After a series of shots, I dropped the gun and ran to the house, managing to close the door behind me. Then something hit it, but I didn't hear any more sounds. Only those same clicking sounds. After that, I called the police, but by the time you arrived, the fog had cleared and I didn't dare go out to check. After hearing Bill's story, it was clear that it perfectly matched mine. Meeting David's gaze, we shared a silent understanding. Then he led me to the scene, prefacing, "When we arrived here and saw what had happened, damn, it really shocked us, and now you'll see it all yourself and understand." Approaching the barn, I discovered a sight that shocked me. Gnawed dog bodies, leaving only bones shining in the sun. But these weren't ancient remains. They were fresh, sun-glinting bones, seemingly meticulously cleaned of skin and flesh. But the scariest part was that they left complete intact skeletons. It seemed as though someone had simply sucked out all the flesh. Around lay the remains of 3 dogs. Nearby, someone exclaimed, "Oh my God, my dogs! What happened to them?" It was Bill. David admitted that he hadn't dared to show the farm owner what had happened earlier. We continued our journey and soon reached the cattle pen, fenced off with wooden beams. Before we entered, David pointed out the tracks, the same huge ones we had found in the park, resembling wolf tracks but much larger, alongside which were numerous small, thin tracks resembling those of birds. After examining them, we entered the pen, where a horrifying sight awaited us. Evidently, there used to be a herd of cows here. I counted about 25, but all that remained of them were skeletons, akin to the fate of the dogs. I glanced at the farm owner, whose face turned completely pale with shock. David approached me and asked, Do you think it could have been aliens? Unable to muster the strength to deny it, I replied, "Damn, after seeing everything, you can believe anything." The dog and cow skeletons left without flesh and hides created a scene that led to the most incredible hypotheses. "I've already called in specialists," David informed me, surveying the scene. "They should arrive soon. The problem is that such an attack could also happen to humans. We need to take some measures." We both stood there, shocked by what we had seen, when a team of forensic experts arrived and began collecting samples. "Listen, buddy," David turned to me. "This is some serious stuff, and it would be great if you could help me with this." "Of course, no problem," I replied. "I'll start my investigation. If similar incidents occur, keep me informed." With that, our conversation ended, and I returned home, then headed to work. There I met Sarah and told her about what had happened. This story truly frightened her. We sat, trying to figure out what it could be, but nothing sensible came to mind. Suddenly, Sarah looked up and said, "I remembered something. We passed by an Indian cemetery at the beginning. Maybe it's somehow connected?" I also recalled it. "Indeed, if this is related to something supernatural, this place could play a role," I said. "Perhaps you're right. This week I'll visit my acquaintance in the reservation nearby and ask him more about it." A couple of days passed, during which we tried to find traces of Ethan, but to no avail. The next day I had a planned visit to the reservation, but my plans were disrupted by another call from David. "Hello, hey Mike. You need to come urgently. Something terrible has happened here. It's really a horrific sight. Come to the Green Street area, where concerts and festivals usually take place. It's urgent, Mike. Waiting for you," David said over the phone. I promised to come soon and hung up. Then I noticed that the office was buzzing. Such commotion usually only happened during major incidents. I asked a colleague what had happened, and he informed me about a massive attack at a music festival. Realizing that it was serious, I hurried to the scene. On the way, it was evident that an emergency situation had occurred in the city. Fire trucks and ambulances were rushing in one direction. Upon arriving, I saw a large gathering of service vehicles and many concerned people. Medical personnel were assisting young people who seemed utterly shaken. Passing through the cordon and informing them that I had been summoned by Detective David, I was allowed into the crime scene. The concert venue was cordoned off. Many police officers, forensic experts in protective suits, and other specialists were surveying the area. Approaching, I found David, who was in conversation at that moment. When he saw me, he motioned for me to join him and said, "Damn, this time it's serious. You need to see this." Leading me to the scene of the tragedy, I encountered a horrific sight. Numerous human skeletons lay on the ground without flesh, creating a grim and terrifying atmosphere. David explained to me that a concert had taken place here, gathering many young people. Everyone was having fun, unaware of the looming threat. Suddenly, the venue was engulfed in fog, which initially didn't cause concern. However, soon screams of horror and pain rang out, and panic ensued. Something unknown hiding in the fog began killing people. As he continued to explain the situation, he led me to a group of people sitting, covered in blankets and trembling with fear. The suffocating terror was evident in their eyes. "These are the survivors. We managed to barely get their testimonies," David concluded. Surveying the young people who had survived their worst nightmare, I wondered if they would ever recover from the horror they had experienced. David approached me again and informed me that 25 people had died, and this time, the investigation would involve the Federal Service. The dispatch of a significant number of personnel was expected, as well as the deployment of special forces, and even the possibility of mobilizing the National Guard for searches over an extensive area. "Do you have any theories about what this could be?" he asked me. I shared my thoughts with David about the cemetery and my plan to visit the reservation. "That's a great idea," David agreed. "I'll go with you. Wait for me here for about 20 minutes. I'll finish up with things, and then we'll go together." After some time standing by my pickup, I saw David heading towards me. We got into the car and headed west from the city, where the Indian reservation was located a few miles away. There lived my acquaintance Jack, who held the position of head of the local community. As we approached the reservation, we were greeted by vast untouched lands shrouded in tranquility and silence, against the backdrop of which modern elements sharply contrasted. Signs, small road signs, and modest informational signs telling about the history and culture of the local residents. The landscapes of the reservation were diverse, from lush forests to open spaces with low vegetation, creating a sense of harmony with nature. Driving onto the reservation, we noticed several scattered dwellings throughout its area. These were modest houses, combining both traditional and modern construction techniques. Despite their simplicity, the houses seemed cozy and welcoming. Around the houses, various utility buildings could be seen, as well as small gardens where vegetables and herbs were grown. As we moved through the reservation, we began to notice people going about their daily activities. Some of them stopped to wave at us in a friendly manner. Pulling up to one of the houses located in the heart of the reservation, we parked the car. The house in front of which we parked stood out among the others for its neatness and well-kept appearance. Surrounded by a low fence, it was built of wood, which gave it a warm feel. Around the house, various flowers were blooming, and there were 2 chairs and a small table at the entrance, creating a cozy atmosphere for evening gatherings outdoors. We approached the door and knocked. After a moment, Jack came out to us. He was of average height with a strong and sturdy build, indicating a person accustomed to physical labor. Jack's eyes were dark and penetrating, studying us with curiosity and friendliness. Jack was dressed in the traditional clothing of his people, which included a brightly embroidered shirt and wide trousers adorned with patterns. A band adorned his head, symbolizing his status in the community. Jack invited us inside and led us into the living room, where we comfortably settled on the couch. Within moments, he returned with a tray on which cups of fragrant tea were placed. "It's been a while since we've seen each other, Mike. Tell me, what brings you to my neck of the woods?" he calmly asked, pouring the tea. We shared with him the story of the incidents in the city and mentioned the Indian cemetery. Jack listened attentively and, with a sigh of surprise, remarked, "It really sounds like something supernatural." Then he pondered something. "Tell me, what do you think? Could this be connected to the cemetery? Or perhaps you know some myths on this topic?" I asked him. He paused for a moment, scratching his chin, and replied, "There is one legend that could explain what's happening, although I'm not sure if it's directly related to the cemetery. Just listen." And then he began to tell his story. In ancient times, when the lands were young and the forests were dense among the Indian people, there was a legend of the great wolf spirit, known as Manitu Wanderer. It was said that he roamed the world between the living and the dead, governing the souls of those who had already departed earthly paths. Manitu Wanderer was the guardian of order between the worlds, but his power was dual, just like himself. Once, the world of the living and the world of spirits collided due to a rupture created by human greed and disrespect for nature. This rupture allowed the souls of the dead to return to the world of the living, not for reunion, but for vengeance and chaos. Seeing the destruction caused by this imbalance, Manitu Wanderer decided to intervene to restore order. According to legend, the wolf spirit possessed a powerful amulet made of moonstone and wolf fang. This amulet gave him the power to control the souls of the dead, summoning them and sending them back to the realm of shadows. But Manitu Wanderer knew that direct intervention would alter the natural course of things. So he chose another path. He appealed to the elders of the tribe to gather warriors and shamans to perform a ritual that would restore harmony between the worlds. For 3 days and 3 nights, the tribe gathered around the sacred fire, praying and offering sacrifices to Manitu Wanderer to appease him and restore balance. At the culmination of the ritual, when the moon reached its fullness, Manitu Wanderer appeared before the tribe accompanied by a pack of wolf spirits. The great wolf spirit raised the amulet to the heavens, and its light filled the rift between the worlds, sealing it and sending the souls of the dead back to the realm of shadows, restoring peace and order. Since then, Manitu Wanderer has become a symbol of protection and balance restoration. The legend says that every time harmony between the worlds is disturbed, one should look at the moon, and the glow of the amulet of the great wolf spirit can be seen, reminding of the need for respect for nature and the world of spirits. We absorbed every word of this amazing story attentively. Reflecting on the tale, I couldn't help but think that in many ways, this legend echoes in our events. Perhaps these huge tracks belong to a giant wolf, but then who left those small prints? I pondered aloud. Turning to Jack, I asked, "What do you think? How can we defeat this creature?" After a moment of thought, he replied, "If this is indeed Manitu, then perhaps the key is the amulet he always carries with him, which emits his power." We immersed ourselves for a moment in reflections on what this amulet could be. But soon realization dawned on me. Here we were in the middle of the day, discussing matters pertaining to the supernatural, and suddenly the atmosphere around us seemed to be filled with a certain mystique, lending everything that was happening a surreal tint. It was truly a strange and unusual feeling. After finishing the tea, we thanked Jack for his hospitality and wisdom, and then headed back to the city. Upon arriving, we found that armed squads had begun to arrive in the city. It was a special forces unit, although it was difficult to say exactly which service it belonged to. David made a call to someone and then asked me to go to the outskirts of the city, where a military camp had already been set up. Surveying the scene spread out before us, I realized that the situation had taken a very serious turn, as significant forces were now involved in resolving the problem. Arriving at the camp, we were directed to the chief of staff. He was a typical military man in camouflage uniform with imposing mustaches. He greeted us warmly and asked us to explain all the details of our story. Listening to us, he seemed to hesitate for a moment, and from his facial expression, I understood that he was wavering whether to believe us or not, as our story indeed seemed incredible. Upon completion, he said, "I have taken note of your story, but we will act by the book. We will divide our forces and conduct searches of the forest by sectors." We asked for permission to join one of the groups, and to our surprise, he agreed, considering our affiliation with law enforcement. Summoning one of the commanders, a lieutenant named Smith, he assigned us to his command. The lieutenant nodded in agreement and led us to his men, where we were introduced to the soldiers and provided with the necessary equipment. Soon, the order to move out was given, and we, getting into jeeps, set out on our way. 20 minutes into the journey, we found ourselves at the edge of the forest, where Lieutenant Smith announced that we were to inspect a specific area of the territory. Together with the squad, we entered the dense thickets of the forest, where every step concealed uncertainty. The forest enveloped us in its silence, broken only by the rustle of our footsteps on the fallen leaves and the distant sounds of forest life. The soldiers moved confidently, but there was tension in their movements, as if they expected something unexpected to happen at any moment. Lieutenant Smith occasionally gave commands, regulating the course of the search operations while we tried not to lag behind, looking around. Our path was illuminated only by the rays of the sun, piercing through the dense foliage, creating patches of light and shadow on the ground, which added even more mystique to the surrounding landscape. Exploring every clearing, every overgrown corner, we hoped to find some clue or hint. From time to time, the forest would throw false clues at us. Sounds that seemed like footsteps or the rustling of something big made us freeze and strain our hearing. But each time it turned out to be just a figment of our imagination, fueled by our fears. Nevertheless, the further we progressed, the more intrusive became the feeling of an invisible presence, as if the forest were watching us, assessing our actions. But apart from this oppressive feeling, we found no concrete evidence of our purpose. As the sun began to set, it became clear that our searches had not been successful. We had explored the designated square inside and out, but had not found the slightest trace or confirmation of our fears. Considering that we had little time left, I suggested making a short detour and checking out the Indian cemetery. This area was familiar to me, so I confidently pointed in the direction, assuring that we could reach it in just half an hour. After a short deliberation, Lieutenant Smith agreed, and we immediately set off. The hike to the cemetery was quiet, only occasionally interrupted by the rustle of leaves under our feet and the distant sounds of forest life. The surrounding nature seemed to freeze in anticipation, realizing our goal. The landscape gradually changed as we approached the cemetery, becoming more severe and impressive. The trees seemed older, and the air was saturated with the scent of the past and secrets. When we reached the designated spot, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft sunset hues. Approaching one of the monuments, I noticed on it a worn-out sign in the shape of a crescent, which undoubtedly resembled a wolf's fang. This discovery made me freeze in the realization that this place indeed had a direct connection to the legend of Manitu. I turned to share my discovery with David, but the words froze on my lips when I saw the expressions on the faces of my companions. Everyone around started exchanging frightened glances, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The reason was the slowly spreading fog around us, which seemed to emerge out of nowhere and began to envelop the cemetery, making the surrounding atmosphere even more mystical and ominous. The silence around became almost palpable, interrupted only by our heavy breathing and the beating of our own hearts. Then, in this all-encompassing silence, crackling sounds rang out, causing us to tense even more. At first, they seemed distant and barely perceptible, but with each passing minute they grew louder and clearer, as if the source of the sound was approaching us through the fog. And then, in that flickering darkness, red eyes began to appear. At first one pair, then another, and soon around us through the mist a multitude of red dots menacingly twinkled. They seemed to peer into us, assessing, scrutinizing, causing every cell in our bodies to fill with chilling fear. We stood, petrified with horror, realizing that our encounter with the legend might have been all too real. For a moment, it seemed that time stood still, and the whole world narrowed down to this moment of confrontation with the unknown. In an instant, Lieutenant Smith urgently called for backup over the radio, his voice sounding urgent and alarmed. But before reinforcements could arrive, horrifying silhouettes began to manifest from the dense fog. First came a gigantic humanoid wolf whose imposing figure towered over us. Its fur was as dark as night, eyes glowing with red fire, full of bloodlust and anger. The wolf's powerful paws seemed crafted for destruction, and its razor-sharp fangs looked menacing enough to make the blood run cold in our veins. Following it, skeletal wolves began to materialize from the mist. Their eye sockets glowed with the same red light, and some of them had traces of flesh emerging on their bones, creating a grotesque contrast between the living and the dead. They turned their empty gazes towards us, beginning to growl menacingly. The atmosphere of tension reached its peak when one of the soldiers, unable to withstand the pressure, fired a shot. This shot served as a signal to the start of the skirmish. Wolves, animated by some ancient evil, attacked with unprecedented ferocity. They lunged at the soldiers, their fangs effortlessly piercing through protective gear, sucking the life out of their victims. Cries and moans filled the air, creating a hellish scene on Earth. I fought back, trying to protect myself and my comrades. But the enemy's strength was overwhelming. In that moment of desperate despair, David grabbed me and dragged me down the stream, trying to get us out of harm's way. We ran over slippery rocks, wading through the cold water that lashed at our feet. The sounds of the skirmish gradually faded behind us, but fear continued to drive us forward. We ran, straining every muscle, every nerve, trying to get as far away as possible from the scene of the nightmare unfolding behind us. The forest under our feet quickly gave way to the stream, whose cold waters enveloped our boots, making each step heavier than the last. The air around us was filled with the scent of moisture and earth, which suddenly began to mix with something cold and damp, foreshadowing the approach of the fog. And then we felt the fog thickening behind us like a living creature, eager to engulf us in its embrace. Looking back, we saw dense streams of fog slowly but steadily catching up to us, spreading across the ground like a blanket, concealing the unknown beneath it. The sounds of clicks and rustles grew closer and clearer, filling the air with a sense of imminent danger. These sounds emanating from the fog made our hearts beat even faster, and thoughts of being pursued by something indescribable spurred our steps. We ran with all our might. Each time it seemed that the fog was catching up to us, forcing us to give it our all, discarding all fatigue and fear. Breathing became increasingly difficult. Panic hung in the air, but we continued to move forward, hoping to find shelter, or at least temporary salvation from our invisible pursuers. Continuing our desperate run through the fog-shrouded forest, we suddenly noticed assistance. A group of armed soldiers in full gear swiftly arrived at the scene of the skirmish, quickly and efficiently beginning to surround the area. Their numbers were impressive, and they immediately engaged in combat, creating a new front of resistance before our eyes. In the midst of the new battle, my attention was drawn to a massive wolf, standing out with its power and ferocity. Around its neck hung an amulet, catching my eye with its shimmer even through the veil of mist. Realizing the key role of this amulet, I shouted to the soldiers to focus fire on the wolf and try to sever the amulet. My words found resonance among the commanders, and one of them immediately gave the order. In the next moment, hundreds of bullets flew towards the wolf, but they only glanced off its dark fur, causing no significant harm. The creature seemed invulnerable, indestructible. And then I noticed David seizing the moment, taking aim and waiting for the optimal time to shoot. When David fired, a sharp, piercing click rang out. The amulet around the wolf's neck, as if sensing the impending threat, briefly flashed brighter before shattering into two pieces. When the amulet was shattered, the enormous wolf let out a long, agonizing howl that reverberated throughout the surroundings, sending shivers down even the bravest soldiers' spines. Something incredible began to happen around it. The fog started to dissipate, and the wolf's skeletons, which just moments ago were full of aggression and strength, began to crumble into dust as if their connection to this world had been severed forever. What happened next resembled a slow awakening from a nightmare. Silence descended, only occasionally interrupted by the quiet sounds of the forest returning to its usual life. The soldiers, stunned by what had occurred, gradually lowered the tension until they ceased fire, realizing that the threat had been eliminated. As the smoke of battle cleared and the world around began to regain its familiar outlines, I saw in the place of the massive wolf my friend Ethan, lying unconscious. The shock of seeing my old friend before me was so great that it momentarily paralyzed me. My legs carried me to him, while my heart pounded with both horror and hope. The fear of losing a friend mixed with relief when I finally heard his breathing, weak but steady. Medics, quickly arriving on the scene, took Ethan under their care, providing him with first aid before preparing him for transportation to the hospital. It was difficult for me to look away from the stretcher carrying Ethan. My heart was filled with concern for his condition. It was several days before Ethan regained consciousness. His account of only remembering a strange sensation and the fog made me ponder many things. Local authorities and experts began investigating the incident, trying to understand how Ethan became involved in these events and what exactly led to such an outcome. Following the events, there were long and exhaustive inquiries into Ethan's role in these events. Questions of his guilt or innocence occupied the minds of many, from law enforcement agencies to ordinary citizens. People wanted to understand how an ordinary person could become the central figure in such an incredible story. The investigation tried to unravel the complex situation, gathering witness testimonies, analyzing all available evidence, and trying to link Ethan to the ancient legend of the Manitu. Supernatural experts and researchers from different parts of the country came to give their assessment of what was happening. While some saw Ethan as a victim of circumstances in the wrong place at the wrong time, others were convinced of his involvement in summoning entities from the otherworldly realm. Debates about whether Ethan possessed any unknown abilities or became an unwitting instrument in the hands of ancient forces raged on. Ethan himself, gradually recovering from his ordeal, found himself in the spotlight, trying to answer questions for which he himself could not find explanations. His life was turned upside down, and he felt the weight of others' expectations and suspicions. Ultimately, despite all the inquiries and debates, no compelling evidence of Ethan's guilt was found. The story involving him remained shrouded in mystery, and questions about what really happened that night remained unanswered. Over time, interest in the case waned, but for those who had faced the inexplicable firsthand, these events would forever serve as a reminder that the world is full of mysteries, answers to which we may never find.